Good morning, everyone. I'm
Morning.
Lance Barron, president of the Sisters in Crime Atlanta chapter, and you have tuned in to Off the Shelf, where Don Gepfer will interview a best-selling author today, Christopher Swann. If you have questions during the presentation, you can put them in the text, or if there's a suitable pause, you can ask the question direct. But we prefer you put them in the text for smoothness and continuity, but it's not absolutely necessary. Off the Shelf is a program that offers to readers who can see and experience and talk to new authors or authors with new books. And the other program we have for readers is also on Zoom, and that's Reader Rendezvous, and that's at 10 o'clock on the first Saturday of every month. And today's guest is Christopher Swann. He's a best-selling novelist and teacher. He's a member of the Atlanta Writers Club and the International Thriller Writers. He earned his Ph.D. in creative writing from Georgia State University. He's been Georgia Author of the Year, Townsend Prize finalist, and he's long listed on the Southern Book Prize. He lives with his wife and two sons in Atlanta, and he is the chair of the English department at Holy Innocents Episcopal School. And we're very happy and excited to have Chris with us this morning. Dawn, take it away.
Thank you, Lance, and welcome everybody. Another way that if you have a question or you'd like to speak up, you can raise your hand. I think it's under reactions, or yes, under reactions, and you can raise your hand, and that'll also let us know that you would like to talk directly with us and with Chris Swann, who I'm so excited to have here today. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, everybody, for coming, especially on a Saturday morning. I appreciate it.
We appreciate you being here. And this has been a long time coming. When we first started chatting about getting you on the program, we actually had to move it out, and look ahead several months, because between the two of us, we had things going on. And so I'm so happy that it finally worked out for us to get together. So as Lance mentioned, this program is designed for readers and an author to engage. And the purpose is for the reader audience to get to know an author on an up close and Zoom personal level, and get to know them and hopefully be intrigued by their stories enough to get those books off the shelf and in the hands of readers. So that is our goal today. And I always like to start off the conversation by asking our author to tell us a little bit about themselves beyond the bio on their book. So Christopher, if you would share a little bit about yourself, or a lot of it, we want to know who is Christopher Swann aside from author extraordinaire?
I don't know about author extraordinaire, but I'll take that. Thanks, Dawn. I was sharing earlier that when I first set up a Twitter account, and I did that years ago, and my agent's like, you have to be on Twitter. Authors have to do this now. And you have to, you have to be very pithy, and you have to say things in very few words, and you have to have a description of who you are. And I said, teacher, reader, writer, husband, father, 5 for the price of 1. And that's kind of stuck. And I like that. I'm a high school teacher, which I started doing, 30 years ago or more. And that was going to be the way I was going to pay the rent while I wrote the great American novel, whatever that is. And I ended up stumbling into a profession that I love, and I still do. I am a father. I have 2 sons, one in college, one in high school. He goes to high school where I work, which is always interesting. My wife is my college sweetheart, and she is my first reader and critic, and whose advice I've come to appreciate more and more as the years go on. I think early on it was a little, she's like, this is boring. Like, real men and women don't talk like this in this scene. You're going on too long describing the woods. And I'm like, I know what I'm talking about. And, you know, like 99 times out of 100, she's right.
Mhm.
So like I said, I've come to appreciate her. I'm a prep school kid who, it's funny because you talk to writers, and when you read famous writers, especially American authors, not just, but you look at their bios, and often they're littered with, you know, there's a troubled childhood, or there's some sort of horrible traumatic event, or you know, there's lots of alcohol or drug abuse or stories like that. And I'm none of those things, which is a good thing for a life. And it's a good thing as a writer too. I think I've been very fortunate in my life. And I've also been very patient, which I've needed to be, because I've said this before many times. I've wanted to do this since I was 13. And I don't know if y'all can tell looking at me, 13 was a little while ago, but it was worth the wait. It was something that you don't often see. I'll put it this way. I knew at 13 I wanted to be a writer. My first novel got published when I was 47. How many times do you see people who have a dream over more than 30 years? You know, when you're 13, you dream about all sorts of things, right? You know, I want to be an astronaut. And the next week you're like, maybe I'll be a firefighter, or I'm going to be whatever. I was like, no, I want to be a writer. And I didn't work on it assiduously every day or even every year between then and when I got published, but it's something I stuck with. And to see that come true and continue to come true, it's been the most pleasantly surreal experience of my life.
So I'm curious, what do you remember or think happened when you were 13 that made you say, I want to be a writer? What was the tipping point?
A teacher. Was my social studies teacher, Mrs. Corpening. And I've told this story before, but she was frog marching us through the Revolutionary War, and said, okay, at the end of this is going to be a project. And everybody groaned, because we all knew at Wiley Junior High in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, exactly what the project was going to be, because they'd done the same thing forever. The girls were going to do like calico dolls, or like frontier primers. You know, A is for apple, you know, B is for doll. The guys were going to do a book report on Johnny Tremaine, or a poster project on how a musket worked. And I didn't want to do any of those. And Mrs. Corpening, for whatever reason, decided that year to have a bunch of other project ideas. And she passed out a mimeographed sheet of paper. Y'all remember those, with like the purple ink?
You smell them?
Yep. Probably a health hazard. And one of the items on there, I don't remember what the rest of them were. One of them said, you can write a diary, and it put in parentheses, or for the boys, a journal. Because in 1983, there weren't a lot of boys who were like, diary, sure, I'll write a diary. You know, journal sounded much more manly. Right? Like, you viewed this out of wood in the forest by yourself. You can write a diary or journal from the point of view of a fictitious person, you got to make them up, who has witnessed or participated in an event in the Revolutionary War. And I said, I'm doing that. And my friends thought I was crazy. They're like, what are you going to do that for, Swann? Do like the poster project. And I said, I'm not going to do the poster project, because every kid in the class is going to do, every boy is going to do that, right? And she goes alphabetical. I'm Swann, so I'm near the end of the list. I'm not going to be the 7th kid to get up and be like, so here's a musket, and you put the powder, and you rammed it. Like, I'm not. I'll be bored. You'll be bored. So I want to write a story. And I wrote some third-rate, I'm sure it was terrible, third-rate Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett guy from the mountains who doesn't like this king and his taxation without representation. So he was going to pick up his musket, which at this point I knew very well how they worked. I was going to go join the fight. And I love doing that. And of course it was sneaky from the teacher's point of view, Mrs. Corpening, because we had to go research an event. We had to have details in there, and I loved it. I had a lot of fun. It wasn't easy, but it's the first time I remember doing something that was hard and enjoying almost every minute of it. And she praised it, and my friends said it's not bad, which for 13-year-old boys is pretty high praise. And I thought I would like to do, how do people do this?
Mhm.
Even then I knew if you're a writer, you don't just write a novel and go, well, that's that for this year. Now I can go down to my, beachside manor at Hilton Head, and I'll just hang out for another year until maybe I feel like writing another book. Even then I kind of knew that's probably not what writers do. And so looked in the back flaps of books of authors I'd read, and, what did they do? And a lot of them were teachers. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. And some people spend a lot of time in like guidance counselors' offices trying to figure, what are you going to do with your life? You're going to college, what kind of and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to teach. And I'll write.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. And so yeah, that's how that started.
Mm-hmm. And look where it led. And I'm going to share something with you. I know this is about you and not me, but you reminded me of something that I did very similar in high school. It wasn't an assignment. It wasn't it was an assignment for a project, but it wasn't an option. Like the teacher didn't say, oh, you could write a diary. I chose to write a diary of I don't even know what it is. I wish I still had it, but it was a guy who worked in a lumberjack. It was a lumberjack. That's what it was. That's what we were studying. And I wrote about, the hazards of living in the woods and being this lumberjack. And there was a forest fire and all this. And like you said, the teacher praised it. And after the semester was over, I went to see him and I was like, can I get that? He said, I threw it away.
I'm a pack rat. I say pack rat. My wife says hoarder, potato. But I have found, we had to move classroom buildings. We built a new classroom building at my school, had to move my office. And I found I had all these old student projects, some of them from like 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I did end up throwing a lot of those away in the move, but ones that were, electronic. I've still got videos on my computer. I can't update my computer software yet. I have to get all these videos off, these video files off of my laptop, because they're all from student projects where they've acted out Shakespeare scenes or whatever in my classroom. And I'm like, someone's going to want this for a reunion. Maybe I'll hold on to it. And I have no idea if they will, but mm-hmm. I'm kind of, yeah, my teacher, I'm sure, and I probably threw away that Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett thing that I wrote. And I wish I hadn't, not because I think it'd be any good, but it'd probably be cringeworthy, but I would still like to see it again.
Yeah.
Right. And it sounds like a Hallmark commercial, but it's one of those times when a teacher really does make a difference. And there's no like soft golden light coming through the window and piano music when Mrs. Corpening handed my thing back to me. She was this old battle axe of a teacher. And when I say old, she had to be at least 50. I'm 53, so joke's on me. But yeah, it's similar to times when, at least for me and other people I've talked to, where you remember sitting somewhere reading a book and you come out of that spell for a little while, whatever, you need to get up, get a drink of water or something to eat or whatever. And you think, I could just sit here and do this all day. Mm-hmm. And fall into that book. And I want to go back and do that. And writing a book is a lot different than reading a book, but you're trying to create something out of nothing that other people can read. I mean, Stephen King talks about writing as it's an act of telepathy. You're imagining a scene, you're putting it in words and paper, and other people read it, strangers, people you don't know, and they suddenly get the same image in their head. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of powerful. So
it is. It's very powerful. And so I'm curious, as a English teacher, high school English teacher, is there a particular, you had mentioned Shakespeare, but is there a particular author, classic literature author that is your favorite?
Shakespeare, because once I get students get past sort of the language barrier, which is not as huge as they think it is. I'm like, if you can understand Yoda, you can with the syntax inverted in his lines, you can, and you have a good addition to Shakespeare, you have a dictionary at close at hand, then it's not that much harder. Because he writes about everything. And he can, like I put myself in the shoes, what a 13-year-old boy would think of putting himself in the shoes of a grizzled mountaineer who's going to go fight for a revolution. You put yourself in the shoes of people who you don't maybe know, or you're not intimately familiar with, but because this active imagination lets you do that. And Shakespeare can do that he writes men brilliantly, he writes women brilliantly at times. He writes about, peasants and about kings and everything in between. And his plots are soap operas.
Yeah.
Whenever someone's parents ask, why are y'all teaching this book? Why not teach some more, why don't we read more classics? They were kinder. I'm like, oh, Shakespeare, like, Romeo and Juliet, where a 17 or 18-year-old boy meets this not quite 14-year-old girl, and 2 hours later they decide they're going to get married, and she's the one that proposes marriage. And they run away the next morning with this friar who marries them in secret. And then he kills her cousin, and then she fakes her death, and 6 people die. I think you mean that one? And that's Romeo. That's the greatest love story ever written, supposedly. So I love Shakespeare. I love the Romantic poets because they're just, they're a hoot. Percy Bysshe Shelley has this line in one of his poems. It's like, I fall upon the thorns of life, ! I bleed. And my students are like, man, dude needs to switch to decaf. I'm like, yes, yes, he does. And we talk about what he wrote and why. But yeah, Shakespeare's fun because you can get students to actually get up and act out a scene, and there's no one right way to do it. And once you get students past the language and see, okay, this is actually a performance thing, then they get into it. So he's always a fun author to teach.
And is there a particular classic? I'm calling them classics, maybe I shouldn't be, but that you would recommend that everybody should read this at least at some point in your life. You should read this one author and their book, or their, in this case, Shakespeare and a play. That required reading of Christopher Swann.
I'm also odd because I've read Moby Dick several times, and people are like, you mean you skimmed it, right? I'm like, no, I skimmed it the first time I read it. And then 10 years later, as an adult, I went back to it and said, this is amazing. But that everybody should read. I love the Canterbury Tales. If you can read it with either you have a really good teacher teaches you how to read Middle English, or you get a really good translation of Modern English, just because it's a bunch of short stories told by people, again, from all walks of life, who are just trying to entertain themselves while on a pilgrimage. And you talk about it's genre blending. Some of it's not, there's a outside narrative where they interrupt each other's stories and quarrel or laugh or whatever. And it's like metafiction in 1400. What else would I?
Yeah, I'm thinking of us as adults that are reflecting back on our educational years and going, like you said, you appreciated Moby Dick 10 years later and reread it as an adult. So that's what I was kind of looking for, something that as an adult, I don't have a good teacher to help me get through it unless I call on you. What's a good book that I didn't want to read when I was younger that maybe I should pick up and reintroduce to myself?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of and we talk about that as teachers. What books do we want students to read? We try to
Yeah.
find things that are high interest, that will get people engaged, but also are worth, slowing down and talking about in class and sharing and showing, okay, here's how this author does this, and being able to improve your reading skills as opposed to just something that is quote unquote just a fast, good story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard to do, but you want to meet kids where they are. And sometimes saying, okay, here we're going to read Moby Dick. Like I've taught that before to my AP Lit class. I wouldn't teach it to anybody else. And sometimes like, can you do that in high school? Yeah, you can, but it's long. But then again, if I hadn't been taught it or exposed to it, I would not have picked it up 10 years later. I think, when I was a kid, the book and I was a naive kid as a teenager. I remember reading The Catcher in the Rye, which people kind of roll their eyes at now because it's dated. But at the time, I thought, you can write a book like this? You can
Right.
talk like this? Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote 100 Years of Solitude, and that blew my mind. It's a intergenerational soap opera of a book, magical realism, about this family in South America. It's funny and it's tragic and it does all the things. That's a brilliant book.
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody ought to try to check out at least once. I could go on about contemporary. I write crime and thrillers primarily, and I could talk about all kinds of contemporary authors who ought to get a fair shake. Martin Cruz Smith, he's contemporary. He's older now, and he's actually he's suffering from Parkinson's. His most recent book, his character is suffering from Parkinson's too, and he had his wife was basically his amanuensis. He had to kind of dictate part of the novel, and she would write it down. Polar Stars, a book of his that I have back here. It's from here at Gorky Park.
Yeah.
And Polar Star is the follow-up to that. And I remember walking in a bookstore in the mid 80s and coming across, I had no idea he was writing a sequel. And I'd read Gorky Park. I didn't know he'd written this, and I picked it up immediately. And it's awesome. It's one of the top 10, thriller books, and maybe top 10 books of all time for me.
Mm-hmm.
The Secret History by Donna Tartt, that's an easy one. And that fits kind of my first book, writing set in a boarding school. There's so many, and I've met so many authors on this journey. That's been a fun part about being a writer, is that you get to meet other writers, because most of the time, we spend an awful lot of time alone on our laptops talking to people who don't exist except inside of our own heads, and imagining them in conversation or doing things or bad things happening to them, and then writing that down. It's a solitary act. And the only people who really get it are other writers. And so if you get to go to conferences, or you get to go to readings or presentations where you meet other authors, or events like this, right? Those are great, because I've found, the 95% of the writers I've met are warm, kind, generous people. And they're very supportive, because they know they've gone through, and they're going through what you are. Because it's a hard thing to write a book, and it's a hard thing to then, not only when you write the book, and then you realize, now I have to try to market the book. Isn't that your job, publisher? And they're like, yes, but I'm like, or when people people say, so give me the 30-second breakdown of your book. Give me your elevator pitch. And I'm always like, can't you just read the back cover or the flat? Like I'd love to talk about the book and all that, but
right.
I write novels, man. I'm not built for the short. That's why I don't write short stories. You have to end those pretty quickly. I don't know how to do that. Novel, you don't have to end for 400 pages. I can just keep going.
That's right. Figure it out as you go, right?
Just some.
So you teach English, and therefore you are exposed, it sounds like, to a lot of different genres, and yet you chose to write mysteries and thrillers. And why did you decide to go in that direction with your writing?
Part of that is when I was 11 or 12, I got the flu and I was home for like 3 days. I was pretty sick, and it was more just miserable. I didn't need to go. I basically just needed to sleep and drink a lot of chicken broth and fluids, and I was bored. And this is in the early 80s, so I didn't have a television in my room. I didn't have, I don't think we'd gotten Atari yet. And my mom went and got a bunch of books for me to read, because I always loved reading. And they were all, and she went to a used bookstore and said, I've got a 11 or 12-year-old boy, and he's read these books, and I need to get him some stuff. And she brought me back some Alistair MacLean novels, some like The Guns of Navarone, like World War II thrillers. And somewhere in there, my grandfather had given me a complete copy of the complete Sherlock Holmes. And so I had this 3-day period where basically I just shotgunned all of these spy detective stories, and I love them. And I love the mystery, and how, in Sherlock Holmes, Watson can't figure it out, and Watson's not stupid. He often gets portrayed in like older movies as kind of a dunce, and he's not. He's smart. He's a surgeon. He's a war hero or a veteran. He's been injured. He's very loyal. He's strong. He's smart. He's just not a detective. And so I don't feel too bad if he can't figure it out, and I can't, and I don't know what's going on, and Sherlock Holmes explains it for me. So I always love those types of stories, and I love, crime is a great vehicle to tell any kind of story. And because most people can relate. Crime can hit anybody, any socioeconomic level. And crime is just, it's wrong. For the most, it's a violation. Somebody's stolen something from you, and it could be who stole grandma's, apple pie recipe, right?
Yeah.
All the way to how do we catch the pig-faced serial killer? You go, the range is incredible. I like, there's an annual convention of thriller and crime mystery writers called BoucherCon that floats around. That goes different city every year. I think next year, this past year was San Diego. Next year it's going to be in Nashville. And yeah, you've got cozy mystery writers, and you've got, and then you've got Karen Slaughter, right? And everybody in between. So it can accommodate a vast range of styles and themes, but it's mostly there's some sort of order has been broken or violated, and somebody has to come along and fix it. And all of us can relate to something like that. And I think that's one reason it's a really popular genre. And it's you can do all kinds of things with it. You can I'll give you an example. I'm teaching a class for seniors, a senior elective in high school, about monsters. And we're reading Beowulf and Frankenstein and Dracula, but we're also watching movies. And we watched the Godzilla movie. And then we watched, I just showed them Silence of the Lambs. A handful of them had seen that before. Most of them had not. And afterwards, we talked about like all the different ways you can look at that movie. It's a police procedural. It's a psychological thriller. It's about the character growth of the main characters, Clarice Starling, who's a young woman who's joining the FBI. It's a largely male-dominated world. It's a story about women and how they can be, almost literally objectified and victimized. And so you can look at it in all those kind of layers, and you can ignore some of the layers or look at them all at once. Crime stories let you do that. Now I'm getting into almost academic speak, so I think I've lost half the audience. But no, it's and I'm a product of creative writing programs, and in my experience with creative writing programs, which were very valuable to me, they tend to emphasize characterization and the quality of your prose over everything else, sometimes including plot. Like plot's like, yeah, I guess we have to kind of talk about plot. But you really have to describe, how do you describe the tree? And I love quality of language and being precise and getting the right metaphor, simile, and that kind of thing too. But I also like stories where things happen, and it doesn't always have to be somebody with a gun. But Raymond Chandler did say that once, that the plot starts the flag, bringing a man with a gun, and it's for some of my books, it's worked out pretty well for me. So I'm going to kind of stick with that.
So let's talk about your writing. So you're a teacher, you enjoy it. I would consider that a successful career. And somewhere along the way, this dream that you have carried with you since you were 13 has decided, okay, I'm not gonna just sit back and still be a dream. I'm actually going to be something I want you to take charge of and pursue. So what was that like for you, that time in your life, and how did you set aside the time and make the effort to start actually acting on this long wished for goal?
How long you got? No, I'll make this short. In my 20s, I got out of college and I thought, I think I can be published by the time I'm 30. I think I can do that. And I got a couple short stories published. And then I thought, well, then I hit 30 and, I'm married. We just got out of grad school and we're talking about having a family. And I thought, well, okay, well, by the time I'm 40, I can get a book. And somewhere in there, life gets in the way and you have a kid and everything kind of goes out the window.
And those decades fly by, don't they?
They do. Part of it was that I hadn't yet figured out what I was supposed to write. Ed Tarkington is a friend of mine. He's another author, and he and I were both. My first book was with Algonquin, and Ed's books published with Algonquin. And he told me once that, and he also has written about this, that he spent a long time writing the kind of book that you think you have to write if you're our generation, which is and you're a guy and you're going to write in this anything having to do with crime or thriller. It's a dark, broken world where you have a hero who is sullied and makes bad decisions and he has to try to redeem himself. There's nothing wrong with that. And I've written things like that. But Ed was working on a book for years about, it was set in the Colorado Rockies, and it was a corrupt sheriff who felt bad about being corrupt, and the cartels were involved. And Ed's a prep school English teacher like I am, who's not part of that world at all.
Right.
And he said, you know what, I realized that I was writing the kind of story I thought I was supposed to write, but then I said, what am I really writing about? I'm writing about family, I'm writing about loyalty, and I'm writing about mistakes and then trying to rectify them, and it might take years. And so he wrote his first published book, Only Love Can Break Your Heart, which is gorgeous and was a great book. And that was a success. But he'd worked in this other thing for years. He tells me this, and I'm thinking, I've been working on the same book for like 10 years, and it involves a working class family of fishermen in the Georgia coast, and a father and son who fight all the time. And the mom has just died of cancer. The Irish Republican Army is involved. That reaction is exactly what I got from the New York publishing world, which was silence. And because it didn't make any sense, it did to me in some crazy way. But also, I grew up solidly like upper middle class. Other than a couple of political arguments with my father, we never fought about really anything. And even then we didn't. We just disagreed about some things. My mother did not die of cancer. I've gone fishing. I can count in both hands the number of times I've gone fishing. I've been to the Georgia coast often, but it almost is exclusively involving a beach. And while I have gone to Ireland, my wife said it was on vacation. I called it a research trip. I've never, as far as I know, met anybody from the Irish Republican Army. Other than that, I knew exactly what I was doing, right? And my wife, who reads, Kathy reads everything that I write, and said, why don't you, she'd read several versions of this thing. She says, why don't you try writing something you know? And I said, I'm a high school English teacher who went to boarding school, and I don't have some sort of dark path. I feel like my high school students have to write college essays. Write about an experience that changed your perspective on yourself, your family, or the world. And they're like, I'm 17. Like, I've been a lifeguard. Like, what do I? And I teach them how do you take that and spin it. So I had to kind of think about that. And when I say I've been working on this other novel for 10 years, it sure wasn't. It was usually at nights. Sometimes I got up early in the morning. The older I've gotten, the harder that is. And so I tend to write at night, and I write in the summers now a lot. I started writing a novel set in a boarding school. And Kathy and I were folding laundry one night. I just come up with an outline and a main character. I wasn't sure about the plot yet. And we're folding laundry, and she says, what you need? You need to have somebody die. You ought to have him find a body in the first page. And I said, no, he doesn't die. He vanishes. And she said, but what? I said, I don't know. I don't know what that means. I put down a shirt I was folding. I walked down the hall, and I started writing the opening of what became Shadow of the Lions, which is my first book. And, and I had a author buddy online. I'd met online who I said, Johnny, you have an agent, right? And he said, yeah, Molly, and she's great. She taking new clients? Yeah. Would it be weird if I emailed her and said, I know you, and could I send her? He goes, no, I'll put in a word for you. Let her know you're not some, crazy guy. And yes. And that's a whole story in itself. But eventually she emailed and said, I finished your book and I love it. Let's talk. And she became my agent. And then it got published.
And here we are.
We are.
And here we are. And that is great. So do you recommend for those would-be writers who they want to maybe, start writing, like do what Kathy suggested and maybe start out with a story that it's something that and really to kind of get your feet wet?
When I say write what the trouble with that, and I resisted that advice for so long because I was like, what do I know? Like, there's nothing direct. And then you can get hung up, you can get psychologically hung up on, but what if Aunt Jenny reads this? Because this is about her kid, right? Or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so what I think you do is think, okay, what kind of stories do I like to read? What am I drawn to? Or that I like to read, whether they're fictional or real. And what kind of stuff am I really writing about? Like Ed Tarkington said, I found out I was writing about loyalty and family and making mistakes and having to kind of try to rectify those over time. And what in your life do you know that you can draw on well enough that you can fake the rest of it? Because I got hung up on writing a story set in a boarding school because I thought I was going to get some details wrong. I went to boarding school for 4 years. I went to Woodbury Forest in Virginia, and great school, and I loved it. The first 6 weeks, I think I cried myself to sleep a few times, but after that, it was great. And I was afraid I was going to get details wrong, but I was thinking of it like someone's going to be reading over my shoulder like that didn't happen. It's a novel. It's fiction. You can do whatever you want. It just has to be realistic enough to where the reader feels like, okay, this could happen. That's what science fiction fantasy writers do. And we know like that doesn't work. That's not real. We pretend it's real. So I think you think about the kind of stories that you like to tell, you like to read. And what from your own life can you draw on to make it seem realistic, give it some verisimilitude, and then you just make up the rest. No one's going to know. It doesn't matter. I think that's what, and some people like, I've got a great story. This thing happened to me. I've written scenes where my editor at the time was like, you need to cut this. And I said, well, it's drawn. This is something that happened in my life. And that's how it happened. She said, I have no doubt it's not working for this story. Don't be a slave to, don't be a slave to the truth. To like being, you're not being a journalist. You're being a fiction writer.
Give yourself permission to be creative.
Yeah, that's it. You give yourself permission to, so, oh, okay, well, I can just change it. And if you do that, if you take elements from things in your life and you change them, you'll discover something new, and you'll also free yourself up some from thinking, yeah, but that's not how my uncle did that thing that I'm kind of writing about. And I'm not really writing about my uncle, but I'm writing about something my uncle did, and he didn't do it quite that way. So that's what you give yourself permission to kind of make stuff up. It's one of the, when I was in grade school, somebody said, how was your weekend? And I said, my house got robbed. And everybody at the table turned and looked at me. This is right before school. We're waiting to go to class. And so I told them a story about how my house got robbed. This guy climbed up on the roof of a covered patio and a backyard pool to get into my bedroom window, and came in. I pretended I was asleep, and he snuck through my room, went downstairs, came back up with a pillowcase full of jewelry and silverware, and then tried to climb out the window, but he's kind of stuck with this reverse Santa Claus thing with this bag. And so I jumped up and I shoved him out the window and into the pool, and he broke his arm. Police came. It was really exciting. Not a single word of that was true. But all my friends were like, what happened next? And I'm like, well, now what? It's like juggling plates. So I didn't think of it as lying as much as it was like, well, let's give the people what they want. So I kept kind of going, made myself the hero. I shoved him out the window. And it was great until I got home. I got off the bus and walked home, and my mom was like, hi, how was your day? I had an interesting day. I got a call from Betty Smith. Her son Matthew was in your class. And Matthew came home to his mother and told her the most amazing story, that she had to call and make sure that we were all right, and how brave you were to, what was it? Oh, yes, shove a burglar out your window. That was not my proudest moment. That's when I learned, okay, there are times when you can make stuff up and tell stories that's socially acceptable, and there are times when it isn't. And that was a time when it wasn't. Thankfully, some of my friends were like, God, Swann, that was weird. The next day, most of them were like, okay, that was good. You got me. Nice. Right. Thankfully. Right. But yeah, give yourself permission to, you can do that when you're writing a story. Make stuff up. That's what we do.
So you wrote your first novel, and that was a standalone. And then you started a series, and that has been pretty successful. As a matter of fact, you just published the third installment of that series. And so I definitely want you to tell us about the series, but also, from what I understand, you're going to put that series on pause for just a little bit. And I'm kind of curious about that.
So Shadow of the Lions came out in 2017, and it's my first book, and it did better than I thought. I just wanted to write a novel and get it published. It got published by Algonquin, which is a great small press, but it's part of the Big Five. It was part of Workman, which is now owned by Hachette. So I guess it's now really the big four publishers in the world. And I got to go to the Decatur book festivals that existed back in the day. I got to go on an actual book tour for 2 weeks. It's like, I have arrived kind of thing. And so I thought, okay, well, now I know what I'm doing. You ever read about the sophomore work of art, like the second album, the second art showing, the second novel? Yeah, that was the hardest thing I'd ever done, because I couldn't, and I'm not writing Ulysses, right? I'm not trying to create something new with the English language. I'm trying to tell a really good story. And that was Never Turn Back. But I couldn't make it work. There was a lot of backstory, and I couldn't figure out how to fit it together. And long story, so I spent a lot of time rewriting it. And finally got an editor who said, I see what you're doing. I think, because my editor at Algonquin, meanwhile, had left for another publisher. And then my agent left for another agency. So for a short time, I had no agent and no editor. That was fun. A former agent couldn't take me with her, but one of her partners, Peter, who is now my agent, has been since then, picked me up. But for a little while, I'm like, what now? I just succeeded. Now it's all gone. I rewrote this book for so long. It got published in 2020, which was not a great year for books to come out.
Say, wow, that.
Now, yeah, and we were all excited. It's going to come out in the end of the summer. I'd have some time before school started to go promote it and everything. And the world shuts down in March, mid-March. And every author friend I have is like, yeah, that was because no one knew. We're all discovering Zoom, and no one really knew how to do this yet. But I wrote that as a standalone. It's a little grittier and a little darker than Shadow of the Lions. It's a brother and sister are tragically orphaned in a home invasion, which takes all four of them are shot. Parents are killed. And the brother and his younger sister are injured, but they live, and they are taken up by their uncle, their only living relative, and they realize pretty early on their uncle is more than a little shady. He's not an evil person. He's not a drug kingpin, but you want to find a judge who's amenable to a contribution to his retirement fund. You want to find someone who's in the city government who might be able to get something done for you quickly. You need a passport and a different person's name. You want to find some flat screen TVs that fell off a truck. Uncle Gavin is your guy. And the Never Turn Back is a story. The older brother, Ethan, says, I don't want to be part of this life. And so he leaves it and becomes a high school English teacher, like his mother had been before him. And his little sister, Susie, reacts very differently to that trauma. She was kind of an angry young person to begin with, and she grows up wild and kind of untamed, and shows up at Ethan's house, dragging some garbage with her. And the story goes from there, but it ended, and it was Ethan's story. He tells it. And I was done with it. But because I'd struggled with it for so long, and I had to rewrite it, I got to know the characters really well. And they wouldn't leave me alone. The younger sister, Susie, in particular, would not leave me alone. The first scene I wrote with her, I've told this story before too. The first scene I wrote with her, she's eating peas at dinner, and they're cold, and she's going to complain about how mushy they are. And Ethan, this is the night that the home invasion happens, right before, and Ethan's going to make fun of her, and they're going to snipe at each other. And I just wrote the scene so you could kind of get to know who these characters were. And in my head, Susie said, no, I'm not eating the peas. And I'm like, yeah, you have to. That's how the scene works. And she said, no. And I said, actually, yes, I'm the writer. Like, I made you. So yes. So like, I made the scene. She eats them, and the scene died. Now, when I say this, other writers nod their heads knowingly. Mm-hmm. Some people are like, I wasn't hallucinating like she was sitting on the couch or having an out loud conversation with her. This is all my imagination. But I made her do the thing I said you have to do. And then the scene just died. Nothing worked. I could write words, but they didn't make any sense. I got frustrated. I left my computer. Next day I came back to it and said, fine, you refuse the peas. And in my head, Susie said, thank you. And the scene went well. It wasn't an important scene in terms of plot or anything. And then when I was finished Never Turn Back, Susie was like, hello, like inside my head, I'm still here. And yeah, I've got stories to tell. And I said, so I listened to her, and that's what the next two books are from her point of view. Mm-hmm. And Susie is a 20-something-year-old young woman who's, let's describe her as sexually fluid. She's attracted to who she's attracted to, male, female. And she doesn't have much of a filter and has no problem using violence if she feels like it's justified. I am a, middle-aged, heterosexual white guy who's, I'm diplomatic, and I've been in one fight in my life, and it lasted for about 20 seconds because somebody stole my UNC basketball hat off of my head, and I swiped at him to get it back. I ended up accidentally punching him in the jaw. 12. A lot of things happened when I was 11, 12, apparently 13. And that's it. So Susie and I are very different temperamentally, which makes her a whole lot of fun to write.
Mm-hmm.
And I had 2 more books with her. And you asked about it being on pause. I got to the end of the most recent book, Never Back Down, that came out earlier this year. And I got to a point at the end of it where there is a kind of character arc, where some things for some characters end in a place that I thought, okay, that's a good place to end it for now. I've got at least one more story in me for them. But since every year since 2020, 21, 22, 23, I've had a book come out. And which has been a sort of amazing. It wasn't really a plan. It just did. And I'm really lucky that it did, and very fortunate. But I need to slow down a little bit. I don't want to just start putting out a book just so I can. And because I've done these 3, I thought I have a couple other projects I want to work on, and then maybe I'll come back to it. I don't need to come back to it, but I've got an idea for one more story that I think would be good. So we'll see how this new one sells and how it goes, and what else I end up writing. So
Susie keeps knocking, huh?
Yeah, Susie keeps knocking.
Well, so what are you working on now? What's next for Christopher Swann?
My wife is a novel. She's written novels as well, and she has an agent. She isn't published yet. She will be one day. We wrote a book together that we're kind of playing with and seeing, is this something we did this past year? We have an idea for another book that we might work on together. And it was actually a lot of fun because she and I write different kinds of books. And as my friends are like, so y'all are still married? I'm like, yeah, we're still married. It's good. I jokingly say the only time because usually she's upstairs and I'm in the main floor because that's where the dog is. We used to go in and out, and also where the food is. So I usually work on the main floor, and she's up in our bedroom. And we were writing together in a Google Doc, and I'd written some scene, and I saw her cursor come down. And I'm like, don't delete that. And she started deleting something, and I'm like, what are you doing? And my son is like, mom and dad are just shouting up at night or texting, whatever. And she's like, you already wrote this. You already described something that way like earlier. And I said, oh yeah, thanks. But no, it was a lot of fun to collaborate. I thought I would get very protective. So we'll see what happens with that. I have no idea. But yeah, I'm not pausing in my writing. I just want to be careful about what I want to do next. And I'm no longer in my 20s, and so I'm kind of it's not in a morbid way or anything, but I'm like, okay, I'm kind of aware, like if I'm in my early 50s, okay, what do I want to do with the rest of the time I've got? And hopefully I have a very long time left, but I just want to make sure that I don't want to write something just to write something and get it published. And maybe it's not very good, but it's just, I'm just trying to make a couple bucks. And I don't want to do that. I'm not precious about I'm writing literature. Well, maybe I am, but I'm not being precious about it. I'm just trying to be careful, and I want to write something good, and continue to write things that I think are good and that people will want to read. So we'll see how that goes.
So believe it or not, we are already at our hour.
Wow.
Before we wrap up, I just want to open it up to the audience. Does anybody want to chat
Absolutely.
with Christopher before we go? Ask a question. You guys have been quiet, which is fine. And I think that's because we were talking about things and hopefully answering questions that you might have had as we went along. Oh, yes, Mary.
Like I've scared everybody else away by babbling too much.
I'm just glad to hear that someone else loves to do research, because I really enjoy that part of writing. Do you have any tips or anything that you do specifically?
The internet is a great thing in terms of, there's some awful things about it, but one of its original purposes was basically to get information in the hands of everybody. And so it's an easy way to get information about things that I want to write about. Susie is very different from me. Susie, as I said, Susie Faulkner in my Faulkner Family series, and she's got a set of skills that I don't have. She's proficient in martial arts, and she knows how to use firearms. I know firearm basics, and I've shot, rifles and shotguns before, but not at her level. But I can. You want to get enough research to where you can. This sounds bad, but where you can kind of fake that you know enough that the reader will go along with you. I love really well-written historical fiction. One pitfall I've seen of some historical fiction that's not good is you can tell the person's done a whole lot of research, and what they're doing, instead of using that to help the story, like you probably will research and learn far more than you'll end up using in your story. I've seen some books where people just dump all of I'm going to tell you what happens to the main character in a minute, but first, let me give you 10 pages in the Peloponnesian War, right? No one wants that unless you want to read a history book. So, you don't ever want your research to get in the way of telling a good story. Some people, like, you could do research forever in certain topics, in most topics, and never end. At some point you got to write a story. So I think research is great if it helps. Anything you find that will help, any kind of detail, and sometimes it's odd, quirky details. And if you're writing about anything that's set in this, like a historical event, you just got to get your timeline right, or write enough where you can fudge details so it will fit with the story. That's kind of my take on it. But yeah, I'm fascinated about writing events, even if it's more recent history. Reading Dennis Lehane, who's a great writer. He's one of those writers. He's a great crime writer, but he's a great writer, period. His most recent book is Small Mercies, and it's set in Boston in the 1970s. Okay, I was born in 1970, so I remember my childhood. I'm not from Boston, but he nailed the atmosphere of those neighborhoods, the working class neighborhoods, and the tensions that were happening. And he just, that time and that place came alive in the story, but I never felt that the details, I never felt like he stopped to tell us all about, well, let me tell you about this. Let me tell you about how, like, the racial integration of schools at the time was a really big issue. He just sort of showed it. It was just happening in the background of the story. That's just one example. So
He's probably my favorite writer.
I met him at VoucherCon in Minneapolis. He was such a nice guy. I shook his hand. It was like, Mr. Lehane, it's nice to meet you. He goes, please call me Dennis. And in my head, I'm like, I love you. You write good. I love Kenzie and Gennaro, Mystic Rivers. I felt like I was a gibbering idiot. I don't think I was, but yeah, he was so sweet and kind.
Yeah, I adore him. So thank you so much for spending your Saturday morning with us. Why don't you share your website so that, and I can put it in the chat too.
ChristopherSwann.com, all one word, 2 N's in my last name. And I keep updates on I don't post on my blog as often as I should. Not that the world needs one more blog, but I do update, current events and readings and signings and conferences and things that I'll be attending, and also news about future books. So you can always catch up with me there.
That is great. And hopefully there'll be a link to this recording on your website as well.
That is
so that-
absolutely going to be on there. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that we can revisit and future fans of yours can check it out. So before we go, again, thank you everybody for being here today. Just a couple of announcements. Lance touched on this at the beginning. He said that next Saturday we have our Readers Rendezvous. If you're unfamiliar with that, it is a Zoom call with readers. Everybody is invited, and what we do is we talk about books, what we're reading, what's on our to be read list, and every time I attend, I end up with a long list of more books to put on my to be read list. And it's just a great way for readers to chat with each other and talk about what they enjoy, and maybe what they're struggling, with in reading something. And it's friends. It's like a fireside chat for readers. The following weekend on Saturday, the 11th, November 11th, Lance helped me out here. Sisters in Crime Atlanta is having a writer's workshop. It's an all-day workshop. It's in person. It is at the Decatur Public Library. It starts at 10. It ends at 4. It costs $35. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, it's costs $35 and includes lunch, and you can still register. So you can find that information on the Sisters in Crime website or on our Facebook page, and that is www.sistersincrimeatlanta, all one word.com. All right, Lance, any closing remarks before we sign off?
No, it's been a real pleasure having Christopher on the program today, and I'm sure we all enjoyed that and learned a lot in addition to his personal details, and that's always insightful. And
thank y'all so much for having me. I appreciate it. I always appreciate the opportunity to talk to folks and connect with readers. And Dawn, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and back and forth. I enjoyed it very much.
I did as well. And you really helped me think about stories differently when you were talking about Silence of the Lambs and how you looked at the different aspects of it. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. There is so much more to that story than just what we see or read to it. There's a lot more depth to it. So that was very fascinating. I thank you for that.
Good thing. Good thing.
All right.
and
So,
just thank everyone for showing up, and we look forward to having any of you at the other meetings. The chapter meeting, like Dawn said, is going to be the workshop. Writing is Not a Crime is the title of the workshop. And so our next real chapter meeting is going to be in January. I believe it's January 13th, and that will be with Deborah Royce. So thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks,
yeah,
y'all.
and I hope you'll join us again for Off the Shelf. We do it every month on the 4th Saturday of the month. And you can also find that schedule on our website.
Oh, Dawn, but for next month, we're changing that.
We are. And so we do have to change it sometimes to accommodate an author. But one of the reasons we're changing in November is because it's Thanksgiving.
Right.
It would be Thanksgiving weekend. And likewise in December, it falls, the 4th Saturday falls during the Christmas weekend. So we're going to be looking at alternate dates. But that is our goal, is to be consistent with it and have it on the 4th Saturday of the month as schedules allow.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
y'all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.